Well, thank you all so very much for having me here. It's my real pleasure to be able to talk about, maybe it's not a pleasure, but so what I'm going to talk about today is try to give a little bit of an overview about the presidential election, kind of where we've been, where we're going, according to me. I think that's probably beyond my abilities to try to make sense a little bit about how to think about what we're observing and what we have seen in the presidential election. So, as Betsy was so kind to know, I do teach here at Vanderbilt. I'm teaching a class right now on elections. So in addition to my scholarship work, I'm also involved with NBC News, helping them do polling and also calling elections on election night. So that's me trying to look intelligent on the night of the Iowa caucus. So I actually have to go up there on Friday, and I'll be there on election night, sequestered in this room without any windows, as the returns come in, and letting the people on air know when we have enough vote to be able to call an election in terms of who's going to win various states, which is really a fascinating enterprise to kind of think about that. So I use a lot of statistics and a lot of numbers and a lot of data. I mean, that's kind of the world that I live in and love. So there's so much that I could talk to you about today's talk. And so I just want to have a few things to kind of think about to help frame exactly what's going on. So one is that there's a lot of breaking, not news, but I'd say breaking noise. Right? So how many times have we seen that headline? Right? Right? This is from February 14th, right? And so I'm not even going to ask for a pop quiz as to what actually predicated that particular claim, although this is kind of one he took on the Pope. So there's a lot of talk about how the media covers campaigns, which is really important. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that and how that feeds into what the public does. There's another one is that there's lots and lots of numbers, right? We live in a very data-rich society now, and a lot of those numbers are driving the narrative about who's up and who's down. And so giving you some sense about what numbers you should pay attention to and what numbers not, I think is really important, right? We have to be critical consumers of the things that are presented to us, and just because something has a decimal point doesn't necessarily mean it's accurate or that you should pay attention to. So trying to think about what those numbers mean, if anything, is really important. And then the thing I'd like to really highlight is that, even though this seems like a crazy, crazy election and no one knows what's going on, that it's actually somewhat reasonable in some way of thinking about that there is a role that institutions and structure and things that ground the campaign. So it may look like it's the craziest thing ever, but if we take a step back from it and take a look at it, there's actually some insights that we can draw about what's going on and why. That's useful not only for understanding where we are, but also where we might be going in the future. So I want to start off by talking about the media a little bit, right? Because they obviously play a really critical role in the election. And so the media is this very interesting institution, right? On the one hand, it's a business, right? So it needs to make money, right? We're a capitalist society, and the media is just one business of many that they're trying to maximize their profit. But on the other hand, we think that the press is essential for democracy, right? So where do we get our information? Well, we get it from the media. So we have this kind of very bizarre tension in our society where the very people we depend upon to get information, right, about the candidates, about what's going on, about the society, about the world, are also people, are businesses that are trying to make money. And those two tensions don't necessarily resolve itself very easily, right? So in order to get a business, I want to have an audience that's going to keep tuning in, that's going to buy my brand, that I'm going to be able then to sell and make money on, which may not always be what I want to do if I want to kind of say what's true, right, or what's boring, right, or what's objectively fact, right? So there is some little tension here between the media as an institution and the way that we think about what its role is in our society. So in particular, because it's a business and because it wants to get an audience, it needs to tell us a story. And not just any story, it has to be an interesting story, right? There needs to be winners and losers and villains and heroes. And there's ups and downs that make us want to tune in night after night after night. And the campaign, that seems ready-made for that, right? And so the media wants to have an audience, and elections in particular help them tell a story that gets audience.
Right? So there's well-known quotes by like Les Mooney, the head of CBS, that says he loves the current election because people are watching. Right? They're tuning in to see what's going on. And so this narrative, right, is a story that the media wants to keep going on. Now, there's also this kind of tension the media has because they're a business, but they also want to be the purveyors of truth. And so this has incentives for how they cover things and what the information they present to us. So on the one hand, they want to be objective. Right? They don't want to be necessarily be seen as pushing one side in general. Now, this isn't always true. Right? Different media companies have different business models, shall we say. But in general, if you want to think about the media as a whole, right, the goal is to basically try to, be objective as much as possible. But also be very critical, right? Post-Watergate, right, the whole conception, what the press wants to do is to think about holding politicians' feet to the fire. Right? So you can't just uncritically accept anything that's said, but everything has to be interrogated, right, and questioned and treated with a very skeptical eye. And so these two aspects, I think, affect what we see actually being covered. Right? So one thing that the media, right, have to have politicians choose to show up on their programs. Right? So what does that mean? Well, that means that if you go after a politician very, very hard, they're probably not going to show up on your network. So that has some incentives for how things are covered and what the role the media plays. So because of that, they're probably very reluctant to actually go out and criticize candidates themselves. So instead, what they do is they basically bring in surrogates from both sides and let them argue at one another. Because first of all, that's pretty cheap to do. Right? Rather than trying to go out and investigate the truth and figure out what's actually going on in the world, if I have two people just come in and sit in my studio and yell at each other for an hour, right? I appear objective, right, because I'm not taking a position. I don't have to actually pay the cost of actually figuring out what's going on, and then I'm letting both sides compete. Right? So that it kind of plays in. And also, it's always possible that someone's going to say something crazy. Right? And so it's always a possibility that someone's going to break news right on live on your program. So there's kind of the news you want to kind of characterize what's going on feeds into how the politics is covered in the election. Right? The desire to make, a story that people want to see what's going to happen. There's some uncertainty about what's going to happen, and you want to kind of keep checking in. And so if we see about what happened, how this plays forward in the campaign so far, so this is from the Harvard Journal Center, who actually went through and looked at all the press coverage throughout the election, and which candidate in the primaries this is, and which candidates got the most attention. Right? And again, the press wants novelty. They want people turning in. They want to look at what's going on. And the number one person, right, after about week number 7 was Trump. Right? Right? So then kind of Clinton also kind of emerged. And then, Kasich peaked a little bit, and then kind of, he started out real low and kind of went up and then went down, and then kind of Sanders. Right? So that's just kind of the amount of attention that the press is paying to the various candidates across the primary. Right? Which is, and of course, because this is where people get their information, right, this matters. Right? If a candidate's not being covered or being talked about, the chances are that you know anything about the candidate is going to be very, very limited. So another issue is kind of, well, okay, this is who they're talking about, but what exactly are the media talking about? Right? So this is kind of discouraging, but not surprising given the incentives. Right? So only 11% of all campaign coverage dealt with substantive concerns, policy issues, what was going on, things that had to be done. Right? As a mere fraction, right, we're dealing with plans and policies and thinking about evaluating the candidates. Instead, 56% was covered what was characterized as a game. Right? Who's up, who's down the horse race story. Which makes sense because that's what drives audience. Right? That's the story. Who's leading? Who's falling behind? What happened because of someone tripped and fell, or how they did a particular debate performance of a particular tweet? Right? That was what drove the narrative because that's what's changing. Right? Policy platforms are on a candidate's web page, and they don't kind of really change that much. Right? But what's changing is the competitive game, who's up and who's down, and also kind of what the rules of the game are, which is the campaign process. Trying to explain superdelegates, or caucuses versus primaries, or open versus closed rules, and all the differences and the interesting differences that emerge across contests and across the parties. So the media, again, is focused on this competitive game, which, again, has implications of what the voters and us as citizens are able to learn about the candidates. Because we know who's up and who's down, but we don't really know much underneath that. So that's kind of consequential. But it would be wrong to think that this is something new, right? Unfortunately, right? This is an enduring issue in American politics. So this is, it goes back all the way to the founding of the Republic. But even here's a prominent example. So this is the Literary Digest, which no longer exists. So it was for reasons that you may already know, right? So Literary Digest was a very prominent publication in the United States, and one of its signature aspects was trying to predict presidential elections. And it did so by polling its readers. There was, it was a magazine, had a little card that you'd kind of take out of the magazine, you'd say who you supported, and you'd mail it back to them, and they'd tabulate the votes. Right? So this obsession with who's winning and who's losing is not a new phenomenon. Right? So they had done this successfully for every presidential election year, starting in 1916. Right? So this is the cover from the 1936 edition. And so this is kind of literally what they printed in the magazine, the Literary Digest. Just a tabulation of vote results by states. So in our population in 1936, there was 44 million eligible voters. The Literary Digest polled 10 million of them. That's insane, right? You never see a public opinion poll of 10 million people. That's crazy. Right? So they asked 10 million people. 2.4 million of them responded. Right? Largest survey like ever. And this is in 1936. Huge fraction of the electorate. Right? They said it was going to be a landslide for Landon. Right? President Landon led us through World War II, fantastically great president, right? Yeah, not so much. Got it totally wrong, right? Almost exactly flipped. Landon 57%, FDR 43% is what they were saying. Actuality, FDR won 62% and Landon only got 38%. Right? So what was going on here? Well, this was in the period of the Great Depression, and the people who could afford to buy a magazine such as Literary Digest and send that card back was not exactly representative of the average American, shall we say. And so it skewed very, very Republican in this particular election, and it got the results completely wrong. Right? So this kind of illustrates one thing that you always want to think about whenever you see any polls is, well, who's actually responding to these numbers? Right? And is there a bias in terms of who's eligible to participate or not? So if you look at polls now, and so we'll talk about some of these that are just like anyone can enter and opt in, right? Those aren't really super accurate. If you only look at polls that are done by a landline, right? So doesn't include cell phone users, other than kind of people like myself that like taking public opinion polls for some bizarre reason, right? Those aren't super accurate because so much of the population now is on their cell phones. So thinking critically about who's taking these surveys is really important, right? So here we have more data than we ever had before. Doesn't mean it's any more accurate, right? So just because it's numbers or it's quantified doesn't mean you should trust it, right? You have to think about who's actually answering the survey, and are they really reflective of what the population is going to be. And this is particularly interesting and particularly hard in elections because it's not just people who answer it, but we also think about who's going to vote on election day, which causes pollsters such as myself all kinds of problems, right? Trying to figure out who those people are going to be. Because how we do that, we ask them, are you going to vote on election day? And who's raised their hand and said, yeah, I'm going to be a bad American. I'm not going to vote on election day. Everyone says they're going to vote on election day. But a lot of them are lying, right? They're not going to vote on election day. But that's kind of a problem that pollsters have, right? So let's kind of talk real quickly about getting us up to speed. So here's the Democrats, right? The Democratic primary, kind of harken back to simpler days, maybe, right? And so here again, we can see the role of the media and the role of polls. Right? So we think about how the media covered this contest, and there's lots of things that we can talk about after this, right? But I just kind of want to get us up to speed. Right? So Bernie Sanders heads to New Hampshire on Iowa momentum after basically tying in Iowa. Right? In Michigan, right? Sanders had to overcome all the polls and kind of surprise Clinton. Right? Then on Super Tuesday, basically said that Clinton basically locked up the primaries. But then we changed our mind because then in April we're going to say no because Sanders wins in Wisconsin. Now he has momentum even though we just said that Sanders had, Clinton had it locked up, and so forth, right? So we had this narrative about it's a very two-person race. It's kind of going against one another. But, and again, this is like 20/20 hindsight. But if you just look at what the polls, now these aren't, if we look at all the polls that we're taking, just looking at an average, right? So we think that any given poll is probably wrong. But if all the polls are saying something similar, then they're probably not that off. It's possible they could all be off, right? That's what we saw in Michigan. But typically, they're not going to be so bad. And if we look at that, right, starting from February 1st all the way up to the end, we see that it really wasn't all that close. Right? There was a lot of talk in the trenches, in the actual moment, that there was this nip and tuck. But if you actually took a step back and looked at kind of what the gap was, it was never really particularly close. And in particular, if you contrast what we saw in 2016 to what was happening in 2008, right, even as of March 26th, Clinton's lead in delegates was more than twice as what Obama's ever was in 2008. Right? So there's a very much narrative of it being a nip and tuck contest. We don't know who's going to win. But the polls never showed Sanders with any kind of lead or any kind of credible path, to victory, even though there's lots of talk about that. So that's just setting the stage for not only the Republicans, but the general election. And so now we have more candidates. And it's useful to think about what happened in 2012, because I think this shapes a lot of not only how the Clinton-Sanders race was covered, but then also how the Republican contest was covered. So if you hearken back to simpler days, right? So this is kind of, Mitt Romney starts out in July of 2011, ahead in all the polls, right? We're going to have Romney as the Republican nominee. Except we don't really like Romney. But Rick Perry, he's going to be our nominee. So he kind of Trump is to the front, and then no, we don't want him. Right? Instead, we want Herman Cain. So then Herman Cain leaped to the front of the Republican pack, except we chose that we don't really like him. Gingrich, though. Gingrich is our person. We're going to go with Gingrich. No, not going to go with Gingrich. Santorum, though, that's going to be our leader. Right? We're going to have Santorum as a party leader. No, we can't do Santorum. We're going to go back to Romney. Right? So we had this cycle during 2012 where the Republicans circled through different candidates, each one of them taking the lead at some point in the campaign. Right? And that set kind of the expectation of what we were going to see in 2016. Right? So what the expectation now is we have 17 people running for the Republican nomination, right? Because everyone thinks, it is a Republican year. Right? I mean, all the models suggest that Republicans should be able to win the presidency this year, given fundamentals that I'll talk about later. So there's a lot of people entered, and we have a very different trend. And so when we saw Trump take the lead early on, right, the pundits kind of thinking it was still 2012 had some very accurate predictions. So I think Dana Milbank has eaten a lot of paper since then. Hopefully not the computer screen, because I don't think that would be very good for his diet. Right? There's New York Times that the entire, Marco Rubio, right, was clearly running against Clinton now. David Brooks, no, Trump won't win. Right? This was not just a, National Review. Right? Don't need to worry about the convention because Trump won't win. And then even database people, right? There's been this rise of, people looking at data. So here's on 538.com saying that, Trump has a better chance of cameoing in another Home Alone movie or playing the NBA Finals than winning the Republican nomination. So I guess not only is, I think we're going to see a new Trump movie and also him being signed by, I guess it would be the Golden State Warriors shortly. Right? So there's this claim that, again, it can't possibly be Trump, right? Because they were thinking about what happened in 2012. Right, that we had this momentum and the candidate kind of fell apart as more things happened. But is that what happened? Not at all, right? Trump, as soon as he basically entered, right, around August, jumped to the front and then never looked back. Right? So there's a lot of conversation about how it was close, and here's this person right here was Ben Carson. He was making some grounds, and then the Paris terrorist attacks happened.
And he didn't have a great performance on foreign policy, and that kind of cratered his performance. And then you kind of see Cruz trying to close the gap later on, but kind of unsuccessfully so. Right? So again, hindsight is 20/20, right? Clearly. But if you just look at that across time, it's a very different dynamic. Right? Trump got ahead, and it was never looked back. Just like Clinton got ahead, never looked back. Right? So that sets us up for what we're facing now, right? The general election. So just a few things to kind of think about when you evaluate people talking about the general election. So one is that this is what the race looks like and has looked like. Right? So again, this is looking at every single poll that's been taken in the United States, right, since June of 2015. And then the line is what the average is at each day of the percent supporting Clinton and the supporting Trump. Okay? So you can see that in June 1st, Clinton had a pretty massive lead over Trump. But then as of September 1st, 2015, right, more than a year ago, they were basically locked pretty close. And if you look at September 1st, 2015, and September 1st, 2016, pretty similar. Right? So you think of all the stuff that's happened between September 1st, Labor Day 2015, Labor Day 2016, and the race is basically the same place it was. Right? So we had these conventions. Arguably, Clinton had one of the best conventions ever, if you hear people talk about it. Trump had, we'll say, not such a great convention according to most pundits. Right? We had debates occurring. We had things being revealed, right, on both sides. And what's going on in terms of fundamentally, not a whole lot. Right? There's some wiggles up, some wiggles down. But structurally, right, the support that Clinton has is about the same as where it was a year ago, despite everything that's been going on. Right? So again, there's been lots of media coverage. There's been lots of stories about winners and losers and what's going on. But if you look at the actual polling results, yeah, there's some wiggle room up and down. But fundamentally, we're at the same place we were a year ago, right? Despite all the insanity that we've seen in the ensuing time period. So what's going on? Right? So I think there's a couple things to kind of, put in your brain when you hear about people talking about it. And one is that, and then this is kind of where the stability of elections comes into. One is that the turnout, or who votes, is pretty stable. So we hear lots of talking about the demographic changing of the American voter, right? How we come these new voters coming to the system, and that's going to have this massive change in the impact electorate. Now, that's not to say that there's not change, but that change is more glacial than it is instantaneous. Right? So you look at from 2000 all the way up to 2012, right, and the percentage of young people, right, the percentage of people age 60 plus, right, there's been some increase and some changes, but it's really at the margins. Right? Even what you hear a lot of people talking about is that the electorate is becoming less and less white. Right? True, but we were at 81% white electorate in 2000, and now we're at 74% 12 years later in 2012. So yes, it's changing, but it's changing pretty slowly across time. Right? So, Hispanic voters were 5.4% in 2000. They're only up to 8.3% in 2012. In part because they're one of the largest groups that kind of votes at such a low rate. So 50% of eligible Hispanics kind of don't vote in presidential elections. So there's always this notion that there's a lurking giant here with Hispanic voters, but if history is any indication, more often than not, they'll remain lurking, right? If you actually look at who's showing up and voting, right, it's a pretty stable, slow change across time, okay? So that's one thing to think about. And that's true not only in terms of demographically, but then also in terms of who the partisans are. So, obviously what we're going to talk about a little bit is the role that partisanship plays. So this is the percentage of Democrats, Republicans, and Independents who report voting based on exit polls. Right, so this is done by the National Election Service. So after, on voting on Election Day, they've asked them how they vote and what their party is. And this is kind of the data that I use in part on election night. And here you can see how the partisanship of the electorate has changed across time or not.
So in 2004, there were as many Democrats as Republicans in the election. Right? So 37% of the people who voted claimed to be a Democrat. 37% claimed to be a Republican in 2004. 2008, right, Obama won, right, handily over McCain. That was up now. 39% were Democrat, 32% were Republican. Right? So Democrats had a 7-point advantage. 2012, very similar story. Right? More Democrats than Republicans, and the difference between those was about the same. 2014, I can't add, obviously. Right? Democrats and Republicans were tied, 36% to 36%. So why is that so different than 2012? That's right. It's a midterm election, right? So on the midterm election in 2012, you didn't have the traditional get-out-the-vote efforts that the Democratic Party is able to galvanize on presidential elections. So it turned out to be a tie. And then right now, so far in the polls that have been reported, we see about a Democrat average of +7, right, which is about on line with what it was in 2012. So what you can do, so this is something that I like to do, although again my taste may vary, is that whenever you see a poll being reported, right, that says such and such a candidate is up, go and see the percentage of Democrats and Republicans that they're reporting that answer the survey. And what you'll find invariably is that how that number compares to what the number has been in the past is really super important. So, for example, after the first debate, there was a lot of polls that said that Hillary did very well and was kind of picking up momentum for these kind of these immediate snap polls that were being done by CNN, for example. But if you went in to see who they actually surveyed, there was far more Democrats in their sample than we think actually vote in general election day. Which then, it's not surprised that Democrats think that Clinton did better in a debate than Trump supporters. And if there's more of them in the sample, then that's going to be a problem. Right? Conversely, there's been other polls that say Trump is closing the gap after after Hillary had a particular bad case with some of the WikiLeaks releases. And you went inside the internals of the polls, and we say that there was more Republicans answering that survey than would be expected on Election Day. So this is why you can't take those top-line numbers, Trump +5 in Ohio, but then you go and look at actually who's being surveyed in that survey, and it's more Democrat or more Republican than we might actually expect. Right? So that's kind of one way to think about what the polls actually look like, is that if on any national number, if you see a number that's very different from that, right, you should be wary. Now, there are more Democrats than Republicans, and one of the tricky things is how many of those will actually show up on vote in Election Day, right? And to be honest, that's a guess that pollsters make, right? And that's hard to do. But if this number is very, very off, then you know prima facie that that's some reason to be concerned with those numbers. Now, why is that the case? And this is a bad Vanderbilt joke. Right? But I'm hoping to get us to a bowl game, one way or the other, right? So, and it's the case that partisanship, right, not surprisingly, has a huge, huge, huge role in election outcomes. And we tend not to, it seems obvious, but it's true. So if you think about, this is an NBC Survey Monkey poll that I'm involved in with NBC and kind of work on with some graduate students here at Vanderbilt. And you ask Republicans, right, whether you're supporting Trump or Clinton, not surprisingly, right, about 90% of Republicans are choosing Trump. Right? So this whole talk about the never Trump movement or whatever, when it comes down to general election, when it's between Clinton and Trump, right, if I'm a Republican, I've got my team, right, and this is my team's player, that's the person I'm going to be supporting. So yes, there is some break-off, but that break-off is kind of more among the elites, right, and not so much among the party base. And similarly for Democrats, right, despite the rise of Bernie Sanders and a lot of talk about the role of outsiders and how the Democratic Party was imploding, the same story. More than 90% of Democrats are voting for supporting Clinton when it comes to general election. So you think about, in contrast to what we talked about during the primary, right, both parties are imploding. We have the Republican Party with Trump that doesn't really seem like it fits conventionally with what the Republican stands for. You have the Democratic Party with Sanders and Clinton fighting over the progressives and how progressive the Democratic Party is going to be. But yet now, what was that? That was all a bunch of talk, basically. Because when it comes down to the general election, it's Trump versus Clinton, right? And if you're a Democrat, you're going to vote for Clinton, right, with 90% probability. And if you're a Republican, you're going to vote for Trump with almost 90% probability. And then how's that changed since the end of July? Not a whit, right? Just like the overall thing, it's locked in. It's stable, right? So this partisanship is really, really super critical, right? So you think about what's going to change these people's minds, it's hard to know, right? And this is true like even in, maybe like, so this is something that we do at Vanderbilt. We do what's called the Vanderbilt poll. And so what we were interested in is basically in the state of Tennessee, for example, what's the breakdown? And here you see the same story, right? Even in a red state, there's any reason to think it'd be different, but 82% of Democrats support Clinton, 82% of Republicans support Trump, right? Despite all the misgivings that everybody has about the particular candidates, the claim that these are the worst candidates ever, right? And in the way that they can be critiqued by any number of ways, right? It's still the case that at the end of the day, whether you're a Democrat or Republican, right, is the best predictor of how you're going to vote. And these aren't just people who say that they're a Democrat, but if the way that we ask this as pollsters is first to ask, are you a Democrat or Republican? And then if you say, well, I'm neither, I'm an independent, then pollsters will ask, well, if it came down to it, would you lean towards the Democratic Party or lean towards the Republican Party, Democratic Party? And so this includes those leaners, right? So it's not just pure partisans, but it's also people who initially say they're an independent, but then you say, well, I lean towards one part or the other. Right? If you just looked at the first one, it's even stronger. So that's kind of a striking relationship between the role that partisanship has in the electorate. And I think that's important, right? Because that filters everything, right? So whether you're a Democrat or whether you're a Republican, filters how you see every single event in this campaign. Right? So this is from Trump's Twitter stream, right, after the second debate. And so there's two things to take away. Is that first that he's doing really, really well on Breitbart, right? 97% win, right, against only 7% for Clinton. But so first of all, none of these polls are accurate, right? Because these are on the internet. Anyone can go click as many times as you want, right? So these aren't valid in any sense of, that's not a Republican or Democrat statement. That's just a true statement, right? Unless you have some ability to control who's able to be eligible to take your survey, and that's a random sample, or can be thought of as a random sample, then you can't trust this, because now you're just seeing how much time do I have to sit in front of my computer and click on one particular candidate's name, which is what's going on here. But that's not the point I want to draw. The point is that here, there's obviously that second debate. I don't know if you had the pleasure or misfortune of watching that. My son had a school assignment to watch that, and after the first question, I was almost ushered him from the room, but I felt it was important for him to, I guess, see what American democracy could be, hopefully at a lower point. But the reality is that shapes everything, right? So here, if you watch that second debate, and even if you watch the first debate, who won? Well, your answer to that question is going to depend upon whether you're a Democrat or Republican, right? Because if you're a Republican supporting Trump, you saw him doing exactly, right, what you want him to be as a candidate, right? Trump is a change agent. He's never said he's going to be a conventional candidate. He's not, right? And so he's acting exactly as he's kind of portraying himself. And the people who are supporting him thought that was exactly who they wanted him. If you're a Clinton supporter, what'd you see her do? Well, she was trying to remain calm, not kind of respond to any of the questions or claims that he was making, and try to show a temperament that is, she claims to be presidential, right? And so the two sides are looking at the candidate in two different perspectives, and it doesn't really matter what either says at this point, because how are you going to connect to them, right? Just like you think about those independent voters that were there, like what information could they possibly learn at this point about the two candidates that's going to, especially these two candidates, like they've been well known since the outset of the campaign, right? They both had perfect name recognition. We've never seen that before. People kind of knew who they were at the outset. And especially if you think about you're a Democrat or Republican, and you're thinking about the race in very different terms, that's going to color how you see everything in the race.
And so you think about what's the potential for changing minds there, it's not a whole lot. Right? So on that point, so here's the recent polls I pulled up after the second debate, right? And before before and after. And it's the same story as before. So polls that are done after have Clinton by 10 points, 5 points, 7 points. Polls that were before had Clinton 5.6 points, 4, it didn't change anything. Right? You could tell maybe there's a story, there's a little bit movement towards Clinton, but fundamentally, things weren't going to change. I remember I was sitting on my couch on Saturday trying to watch football, and my phone lights up by some of my friends in NBC saying, this tape changes everything. This is a game changer. I was like, really? Like, you think this is going to be the thing that changes, the entire election? And among the mass public, right, not so much. Like, was this really new information or relevant information, right, depending on what side you were going to look at? Right? Now, it certainly changed the calculus for elites on the elite level, and so you saw a lot of Republican elected officials start to change their behavior. But in terms of the actual mass of support, there wasn't any kind of real groundswell. Because again, the people are looking at the candidates and using different metrics to evaluate them. Right? What you want if you're voting for Trump is a change. Right? You want to disrupt the Washington system, and that's, the tape doesn't really tell you anything about that. Whereas if you're Clinton, you're looking for, character and experience, and kind of this tape doesn't really convince you that, doesn't really change that narrative for you. So what's in this left-hand column right here, you mean? Those are just different names of polls, right? So that's kind of, basically whatever pollsters are being done, it's all about the same, okay? So this is just by saying that because of how partisan the electorate is, right, and how we use different metrics and different ways of looking at any event, things are really locked in some sense. Right? So here's an example that seems to have nothing to do with politics, right, that kind of, I think, illustrate this. So this is Godfather's Pizza. Right? So all these pollsters, and there's a lot of kind of work done on brand marketing to figure out how desirable these different brands are. Right? So during the course of 2011, there's a survey company called YouGov that was tracking the favorability of Godfather's Pizza, right? So they could sell this information and get information about this. And so there's an index from negative 100, which means you really hate Godfather's Pizza, to 100, which means it's the best thing ever. Tell me I deleted it. So that's horrible. So what you see is that after about, in the middle of 2011, you see Democrats start hating Godfather's Pizza. And Republicans start loving Godfather's Pizza. Now, why would that? So if you remember who was in the cast of Republican nominees in 2012, there was Herman Cain, who used to be the CEO of Godfather's Pizza. And so as soon as he started leading the Republican contest, Democrats started saying, wait a minute, this pizza, horrible. Right? I'm going for Domino's. Whereas Republicans said, Papa John's, no thank you, I'm going to go for Godfather's Pizza. Right? So here we have this partisanship affecting your preferences towards a pizza slice, which is like crazy. But it kind of shows you how deeply embedded partisanship is in how we think about the world. Where here's just something associated with a candidate being affected by this. Right? And so I think that's also important because you also hear this narrative a lot, right? How do we end up with these two, right? The most unfavorable or despised, depending upon, how outrageous you want to be in terms of your use of adjectives, candidates ever. So one thing I'd like to say is that it's certainly true that they have record high unfavorables. Right? But one thing we can look at is like, well, all right, so let's compare how much Clinton is not approved of relative to how the Democratic Party as a whole is disapproved of. Right? So is this something about Hillary, or is this something about Democrats and politics in general? And so what's interesting, I think, is if you look at the percent who have a favorable opinion of Clinton, it's 43%. Right? Not high. What percent have a favorable opinion of the Democratic Party? 44%. Right? So Clinton's favorability is not a whole lot higher or lower than the overall approval of any of Democrats in general.
Right? Now, it is true that her unfavorable is 54%, right? And the Democratic unfavorable is 48%. But it's also true that there's more people who are responding to this question than this question. Right? There's a lot of there's more people saying, I don't know whether I approve or disapprove of the Democratic Party, but everyone has an opinion about Clinton. Right? So what's that to say is that, yes, it's certainly the case that Clinton is unfavorable. But she's not that much more unfavorable than the Democratic Party as a whole. Right? And that's something that's, so is this a statement about Clinton? Or is this a statement about politics and how we think about Democrats and Republicans nowadays because we're so we're increasingly hardwired in our beliefs? Yep.
It makes sense to link that to the percentage of people who have trust in government in general.
Yeah, so I mean, excellent question. So how does that relate to trust in government, right? Nobody trusts government, right? I mean, so this is like the interesting thing is like we think about, Obama has higher approval now than he does, previously. But think about approval in Congress, right? We are at record lows. I think it's like 13% of the public approve of the job Congress is doing. And that number has just been cratering for a long time. Doesn't matter if Democrats are in charge or Republicans are in charge, right? So there's just this disapproval that we have that affects the parties and also the institutions. Now, the institutions suffer because both Democrats and Republicans can blame, right, Congress. Like, everyone can find something they hate about what Congress is doing. Whereas a party, at least you have Democrats who are saying, well, they're on my team, I'm going to approve of them. But you still have this difference that's going on. So this notion about partisanship and how closely attached they are to different conceptions has really powerful an impact. And the same is true of Trump. Right? So let's compare Trump to Republicans. So Trump's favorability is 35%. The Republican Party, on average, favorability is only 31%, on average.
But everybody likes their representative.
That's right. So we hate Congress, but we love our representative. And this has always been an enduring thing. In fact, because a lot of representatives, when they campaign for re-election, they say, well, you got to send me back. I'm the good person. Right? The others are a bunch of jokers. Right? And so you can actually score points by running against the institution, right? That allows you to kind of get that distance room. But I think what's interesting here, so even among the unfavorables, Trump's unfavorable is 61%. Republican Party's average unfavorable is 60%. Right? Those are the same thing. Right? And so this claim that it's not, it's certainly the case that Clinton and Trump are among the most disliked candidates in the history of the Republicans, and since we've been polling at least. I don't know about early days. There were some really bad candidates then. But they're not significantly different than how we think about Democrats and Republicans. Right? So, this is not just, I think, a statement about the candidates, but I think it's increasingly a statement about how we see each other and divisions in our society based on politics. Right? Which is not super great thinking about moving forward. So one thing just to talk about. So as political scientists, we do a lot of work trying to predict who's going to win, right? Because it's kind of fun. So here's a very simple model it's called the time for change model, and it's very, very, very simple, and it's also very accurate. So it says I can predict the percentage of vote that Clinton is going to get, right? So she's the incumbent. She's the candidate for the incumbent party, the incumbent being Obama. Just knowing if I know what Obama's net approval rating is, right, in June, if I know what the real GDP growth is in the second quarter of the election year, and I know whether or not whether an incumbent is running or not. Right? So that's all that I need to know. Right? Which seems crazy, because I haven't told you anything about who's actually running, how much money they're spending, what their ads are doing, or anything. All I'm just telling you is about something about the economy, something about the current president, and then whether or not we have a first-term incumbent in the race or not. And this is called the time for change model because you see the difference between a president running for re-election and not is about 4 points in the two-party presidential vote, which means that in 2012, for example, Obama had basically an advantage because he was an incumbent. But after 2 terms,
it's been shown that Americans are pretty, we like change. Right? We've had 8 years. Well, let's try something else. See what else is going on. And so in a year like 2016, after having 2 terms of a Democrat, historically, or 2 terms of Republican, right? Historically, Americans have gone for the other party. Right? There's all kinds of reasons why you might think that that makes sense, or what you can see what that happens. But historically, that's been the pattern. After a party held the White House for 2 terms, it's the other turn. Right? Maybe they go too far. Maybe we want something else to kind of moderate that. There's all kinds of reasons why you could think that that results in itself. And this has been very accurate. Right? So this is actually showing how the actual election results compare to the prediction of that very simple model. Right? Which is crazy, right? Because I didn't say anything about anything that happened in the campaign. I didn't even tell you who was running. Right? I didn't even tell you who was running. And I could still do a pretty darn good job predicting what the actual election outcome is going to be. Right? 1992, it basically nails it. 1996, 2000, I mean, there's I'm off by a point or 2 here or there, but by and large, by knowing nothing, I can do a great job predicting.
That's 6 elections?
Yep. And in 2016, and I think this is the important part, right? Trump, based on that, should win. Right? So I think, what I showed you this, right, is not necessarily as a prediction, but kind of like, he's obviously underperforming this, right, in the polls, right? So I think that what this shows is that, you swap out Trump with a Kasich or a Rubio or a Bush, and, I think this is probably what you'd see.
Well, that's looking at the nation as a whole, but obviously certain states consistently go the same way. Tennessee.
Yep.
So that means the differences in the so-called swing states. So what makes those swing states, like Ohio, we just mentioned about, swing states?
Okay, good. So 2 things. First of all, it's remarkable that this is able to be so accurate without even focusing on swing states, right? But the point about, you're right, that this is looking at the wrong thing in some sense, right? I don't really care the percentage of 2-party presidential vote, like the popular vote. What I really care about is the electoral college vote, right? Institutions matter. And so then this accounts for what's the difference between the different states. And what accounts for the difference between the states are lots of them, right? So obviously the states vary demographically quite a bit, right? So Ohio, how that compares to North Carolina, compares to a Tennessee, has different favors of support for the different candidates, which is really important. They also vary in terms of the voting rules they use. So for example, something that I've been doing right now is that Election Day is not on, right, November 8th. It's already started, right? I've been analyzing data, right, as it rolls in. It's kind of scary, actually. But as early vote comes in, right, you can actually see who's actually casting ballots already and what regions of the country they're coming from and what precincts they're coming from. And so ballots have already been cast, right, before the debates actually occurred. Right? So in Florida, for example, in North Carolina, they have early voting. You can just use that information to kind of cast your vote before Election Day actually occurs.
So why do you think the first woman nominee is not perceived as a sea change?
So why is the first woman nominee not perceived as a sea change, as a sea of change? Well, I think part of the issue for these candidates is that they've been so well defined because they're so well known, right? So people have a narrative, right, about, Hillary Clinton's been in the media eye ever since 1991, right? And then, so she had a prominent role in 1992 in the health care plan that kind of Bill Clinton was trying to do. And so I think these candidates get defined really early on, and then we have this thing that you can't change from that, right? Because you get pigeonholed or you get characterized as being a particular type of candidate, and if you try to be different from that, right, you look inauthentic, right? So I think why exactly she has the reputation she has, I don't, I think that's been constructed, and there's been a narrative to kind of make her into her and Trump into characters, and why she's perceived one way and the other. I mean, I don't have great reasons for that particular
You can also say the women's revolution's been successful. We really are gender blind, and the presidency doesn't require you to chop wood. In other words, maybe women are not as strong for chopping wood, but we've given that up, and we're looking at that in a different way because it's what's in your head, your experience, your character, and that's gender neutral.
I think it's possible too. I mean, I think the reality is that people, like I was saying, people have different ways of looking at the world, right? And I think they have different perceptions of what characteristics they bring to the table with that. And for people who are well known, right? Is it that people have changed how they evaluate candidates? Is it because they're kind of well known, and I'm not going, there's no information I have about that's going to update my beliefs about you or the changing composition of the electorate? I think there's a multiplicity of reasons as to what's going on.
You talked about the stability of this, and yet when I go to 538,
Yep.
a few months ago, Hillary had, according to them, an 89% chance of winning.
Yep.
That got down to as low as 55.
Yep.
Now it's up to 85.
Yep.
What's going on?
Okay, so what's going on is that I think there's a couple things that are going on. So things certainly do change, I think, in the interim that push things. So I think there's this very strong structural features about what drives elections, right? In terms of how well the economy is doing, how well you think the incumbent president's doing, kind of whether or not there's in this mood for change, right? I think that kind of very simple model kind of summarizes that. Now, that's not an absolute, right? That's not how elections, we don't just kind of crank in numbers there and say, well, this is the outcome, right? Things do happen that kind of disturb or kind of perturb us from what those structural forces are. But I think left to their own devices, things tend to net out, right? So a candidate has a really great first debate performance, then sometimes they underperform in the second debate. And I think that kind of goes back to this notion about the narrative of what's going on, right, in terms of how things are interpreted. So before any presidential debate, you see lots of people talking about what your expectations are, right? And so both candidates trying to say, well, I'm a horrible debater, right? If I just show up and don't drool over myself, that's a victory, right? Because, the narrative matters, right? And so when candidates get too high, in some sense, they're probably overperforming where they ought to be, right? So then there's a claim about someone's making a comeback, right? And then the narrative shifts between, Hillary's doing so well, between now Trump is coming back, right? He's kind of slowly, irking his way back, or there's something that occurs. And so there's always, I think, this movement to go back to where the stable average is, right? So even when you get out of whack a little bit, then the narrative is such that you kind of compel it going back. Because it's not like, oh, Hillary's going to run away with this, although that's kind of the narrative that's going on right now. But usually it's kind of, as soon as one candidate does very well, then the other candidate can't help but do a little bit better than expected. And that's going to kind of drive a little bit narrative. So I think that narrative of change is what really drives that. So on that point, right, if we think about the possibility of October surprise or surprises, where does that leave us for the race? So again, on this point, overall, it's a period of remarkable stability, right? There's never been a single instance since the beginning of the campaign where Trump has basically won in an average of polls, right? And I think that's important. Right? Not because that's predictive, because who actually shows up and votes on election day is what's going to determine it. But at least in the polls and public opinion so far, it's a pretty stable, depiction of what's going on. And that differs, right, from other elections. So here is Romney and Obama, right, in 2012, right? Unlike what you see now, especially at the end, it was nip and tuck, right? Moreover, if you look at that difference here, now we have an 8-point gap, and that's, and this figure goes basically Trump between 35 and 55. Here, the entire range of that graph is between 42 and 47, right? So all this up and down occurs within the difference between Clinton and Trump. So much different race in terms of how the candidates are polling. 2008. Looks a little bit similar to what we're seeing now, but still different. Because there were periods of the race where McCain, right, was beating Obama, right, in the vote. Something we haven't seen in 2016 systematically. And then going back, right, so this is 2004 with Bush and Kerry. And again, right, nip and tuck in the beginning,
And then after Labor Day, in September, then basically Bush kind of widened it out and kind of, kept that lead to the end. But again, that whole range, right, is between 43 and 50. So all that variation is within the difference between where Trump and Clinton are right now. So, what we're seeing in the polls, at least, is very different from what we saw in other elections, right, in terms of the separation between the two candidates and the persistence of that separation. But of course, as the questioner kind of thoughtfully said, we don't really care about popular vote, right? This is all about winning states, and winning states with lots of electoral college votes. And if we look at that, right, then we can really think about, well, what has to be true of anything that happens between now and Election Day to basically change the calculus of the election, right? So one is that the people who are saying they're going to vote for Clinton don't actually show up in the polls. That's certainly possible. But the other thing is, like, if something changes in the race, what does it have to change? Right, so this ranges states from the most Democratic to the most Republican. And as you can see, right, Clinton is never going to lose D.C. Right? And if she does, she's going to lose everything. Similarly, Trump is not going to lose the Nebraska 3rd District or Wyoming. Right? Newsflash. You can write that down. Right? So there's things that, again, they're pretty locked in, given the demographics in terms of who lives in the states, what their partisan leanings are, that just they're not very competitive. So what you can see is that in order to get to the line is what you need for 270. So if you think about for Trump to win, he has to win Arizona, he has to win Iowa, he has to win Ohio, he has to win North Carolina, he has to win Florida, he has to win Nevada, and he has to win Colorado. And he's currently losing all of those except for Iowa in the polls. Now, those polls are variable, right? They're not always the best quality. But still, it kind of shows you that Hillary's path is much easier than Trump's path. Trump basically has to run the tables, right, to win a bunch of those states. Now, so could he win Ohio? Certainly. The polling I've seen suggests that that's, he may probably has a lead or kind of it's kind of close. But that's not going to be enough for him. Because he needs Ohio, and then he also needs Iowa. But if he wins Ohio, it's probably likely that he wins, that he pull out of Iowa. So then you got North Carolina, Florida, Nevada, and Colorado. And he has to win all of those. Right? And so you think about what could possibly change the dynamics of the race that would let him pick up votes in all those states. And that becomes hard. And especially because Florida and North Carolina, for example, are two votes that vote early. And so people are already casting ballots in those states. They've already voted. They're already locked in. And so now there's no potential for them to change their vote. Right? So one of the things that I was kind of worrying about when there was all this talk about him dropping out, which he wasn't going to drop out, but like, what would that do to all the people who have already voted? Right? What a nightmare, independent of kind of your partisan link. Like just from the provision of elections and the stability of election law, what would that even mean? Like, would we have like lawyers in every single state trying to, because the laws are determined at the state level, right? They're not federal laws that determine who votes and when names need to be on ballots. And so that would be an absolute zoo. I mean, zoo is probably too nice of a term of what that would be, right? That would just be horrible. And especially it'd be complicated because, we actually don't vote for Trump or Clinton, right? We vote for electors for Trump or Clinton. And so then that's that's a constitutional crisis potentially. And we have a 4-4 Supreme Court, which is always, So, you could spin yourself into all these kind of crazy and neurotic political fantasies or horror shows, depending upon whether or not you like that or not. But it's not going to happen. But this is the path that kind of Trump would need to run. And so why, if it stays in stasis, it looks like Clinton has a good chance. And again, this gets back to the point that we care about states, electoral college votes, not necessarily two-party votes. And so if we look at the probability that each is going to have enough votes to win, right, this is also on 538.com, we can see that except for a little bit period in August, right, where it's basically tied, it's always been the case that Clinton's been predicted to have more electoral college votes, right, than Trump. Now, that doesn't say it can't change, but unlike other races in the past, this one's been pretty stable. Okay? So the interesting thing that I think, right, so what's going to happen, I don't know, right, but it looks, if history's any guide, and if things continue the way they're going, and by that I mean there's still crazy stuff happens, right, between now and then, but not so crazy as to really disrupt things. So even, for example, think about like something you don't want to like some kind of horrible terrorist attack, right? Would that change the dynamics of the race? And it's hard to think that that would be the case, because if I'm supporting Trump, it shows exactly what I'm talking about in terms of these, the current president not keeping me safe. If I'm supporting Clinton, it shows me that this is more reason than ever that I would need Clinton in the office, right? So what kind of event would really disturb or shape up things? It's hard to think about. Maybe a massive economic crash that you could then kind of blame on the president, but even then, it's hard to know. But I think that one thing it does raise, and you've seen it kind of, especially over the weekend, is what's going to go on in the parties themselves. Right? So how does the Democratic Party deal with Sanders and Clinton, and what does the Republican Party go from here? And I think the most interesting one is one about the Republican Party. Right? Because Trump was not expected to do anything. Right? This was supposed to be Jeb Bush's year. The Republican base got around him like in no way like it had never done before. He had $150 million of fundraising right out of the gate. Massive war chest, supposed to have everyone clear the table for him, so he could just run the table, go right to the general election, and then just kind of pummel Clinton, right, come election day. And that didn't happen. And so now you have basically a debate over what the Republican Party means. And it's now in full display, right? So think about this last tweet, right, that Trump put out. Right? And the problem is that it's not clear to me that this election resolves anything. Right? So imagine that Trump loses. Why? Right? That's the critical question that if you're a Republican, you want to ask yourself. Why did we lose? How do I fix that for next time? Right? They did the same thing in 2012, so they had this kind of thought about outreach and minorities and kind of diversifying the Republican brand, and then that didn't happen, right, with the Republican primary. So now think about what's going to happen here. Right? So already you have Trump and Ryan, Speaker of the House, openly feuding, and other establishment Republicans as well. And so now if Trump loses, right, he can argue, well, they weren't behind me 100%. Right? Ryan wasn't out there actively engaged. Jeb Bush, Mitt Romney, all these Republicans weren't actually giving their full throttle to me, and I could have beat Hillary if everyone was behind me. Right? So Trump can make that argument. People who support him can make that argument, and there may be truth to that argument. Whereas if I'm Paul Ryan, right, or a member of the establishment of Washington Lee, I said, well, we would have won this election, but we had Trump, who wasn't the best candidate. Right? So that's a debate. Right? I don't know how you decide which side's right there. They're probably both sides are right. Right? There's always, in every debate, both sides have some kernel of truth in it, but that has huge implications. Right? Because that's going to determine how you fix how you fix things going forward, or how you try to change things. Do you change the primary process to have now superdelegates on the Republican Party side? Right? Maybe. Right? Or do you change the order that states vote in? Maybe. Right? But depending on whether or not what you think the problem is, or do you mandate that all elected officials basically go all in for the nominee, for the party nominee? Right? So how you resolve that, how you interpret that has really important consequences for what the party does kind of going forward. And I think, talking to, we've had a couple of prominent Republicans, for example, Sally Bradshaw, who was Jeb Bush's chief of staff, came and gave this talk for our undergraduate elections class. And she was actually in charge of writing that post-mortem after 2012 in terms of how the Republican Party could diversify its brand and kind of take a step forward. She is now running a bookstore. So she's like out of politics, became a registered independent, and said, I'm done with it, right? Which is kind of not what we want to have happen, right? We want kind of people to be invested and interested in politics, because this stuff is really important, right? Who runs for president? Who runs for Congress? What they campaign on? What they do when they get there? I mean, this affects all of us. And the media talks about this, or there's this kind of funny thing, or Saturday Night Live skits, and no, it's funny, like, ha ha ha. But these things are really super, super consequential. I know I'm preaching to the choir, as it were, but especially telling my undergrads, you have to care about this stuff. And even if it's not talked about in constructive ways all the time, that doesn't lessen your obligation as an American and a citizen to kind of work to try to, if you don't like it, get involved to fix it. Because if you're not going to do it, no one else is going to do it. So that's all that I had. I hope I didn't go too long, but I'm happy to take any questions or talk about as best I can. Yes?
Can you explain why Democrats did so poorly
Yeah, so why did Democrats do so poorly in 2014? Well, the answer is they didn't vote, right? And so you always have, if you think about the Democratic coalition in presidential elections, it's a lot more diverse than midterm elections. So there's a huge get out the vote effort to try to get members from underrepresented communities, for example, to the ballot box, or kind of do early voting to make, or even young people, right, to show up and vote. And then midterm elections, that's not as exciting, right? It's less in your face. There's less information screaming at you, rock the vote or whatever to kind of get out and vote. And so there was a massive, decrease in the amount of voting that occurred. So, for example, among Hispanic voters, right, I think it was like around 40% of them voted in presidential elections, but in the midterm election that plummeted to like around 20%, right? And so you have all these Democratic voters who vote in presidential election years, but then stay home in midterm election years. And especially if you think that in a midterm election is usually a referendum on the president, and people who are fired up to go vote are people who are, angry, right? If I'm content, everything's fantastic. Yeah, am I really going to go to the voting booth? Unless I'm a really good citizen, I can find lots of ways to divert myself. But if I'm mad as all hell, I'm not going to take it anymore. You'll be damn sure I'm going to go and vote on election day and kind of, make my voice heard. And so I think it's a combination of difference of enthusiasm, and then also just the people who are voting in terms of how much, experience they have in politics and how likely they are to vote habitually. Yeah.
You said that the minority vote in this country is historically low.
Yeah.
Especially after elections, but why would it take to motivate these people? Are they just too busy working? Are they beyond hope that change can actually occur? Is it a matter of education? What's it take to awaken this sleeping giant?
So what's it going to take to increase the turnout among kind of kind of groups that vote at lower than normal rates? I mean, I think the reality is it's everything, right? And so, if people, lower educated people, kind of people with lower income are less likely to vote. Maybe it's harder for them to get to the polls, or maybe they're not following politics as closely, so they don't. So I mean, there's lots of different explanations as to what is kind of going on in those particular situations. For younger voters, they don't have the experience. Right? We show that younger voters are kind of more aspirational. So if you look at the difference between what happened in the Democratic primary, right? All Bernie supporters were all really, really young, right? And because Bernie was running, this is the future. What it's going to be. It's going to be this, everything, everything you want is yours and more. Whereas Clinton was like, I'm going to do this plan, it wasn't very aspirational, but kind of much more pragmatic. And so how the candidates present themselves has very different, as you get older, you realize the pragmatism is kind of, that's what you appreciate, whereas when you're young, as such as just you and myself, and when I was more naive, like, oh, I want a kind of a beautiful vision of kind of what the future is going to be like, independent of kind of whether or not that's actually politically feasible or not. And I think that as you get older, you have more life experiences that show you that, you're younger, you're kind of more, so everything basically changes in terms of your perspective as well. So, yeah.
Other than our governor, have any of our state Republican leaders had much to say about Trump?
So in terms of what the elected officials in Tennessee have said, I think they have, so Governor Haslam, for example, you mentioned his position. The others have kind of disavowed the statement, but not kind of removed their support or endorsement for the candidate. I think Alexander came out the other day. Yeah. Yeah.
Because women tend to be more towards Democrats. It's not a big move, but it's been a steady move. Am I right about that? And the way Trump has been attacking everybody, but particularly women, I've heard a lot of women say, I would never vote for that SOB.
I think there may be, yeah.
They will be right.
I mean, so the question of how women are going to vote, I mean, women vote more than men, right? So they're a larger voting, I wouldn't say they're a block because there's women, different, they're not, they're not all Democrat or all Republican. I mean, they are split. But, in this election, you might imagine, and the polling data kind of suggested that there's an increasing gap in terms of how women and men are perceiving the race. And especially if you look even among Republicans and Republican elected officials, and the Republican elected officials who are walking away from Trump tend to be, on the, female, female Republicans who are kind of a little more likely than male Republicans to kind of walk away. So I mean, I think, gender is obviously a huge, ongoing, continuing issue for a huge segment of the population, and people vote on those kind of aspects.
And you've got models that give more weight to trends like that.
Yeah. So so how do you account for that? And so this gets the question of who's likely to vote and how they're likely to vote. And so if you look at, so when we did some polling about how enthusiastic you are to vote, there's not really any. There is increasing gap in terms of how women are perceiving Trump and Clinton, but in terms of they being more likely to vote because of what he's been saying or what he's been said recently, there's not been a whole lot of change, in that. So there's differences in opinion, but it doesn't seem like that's, necessarily going to change how many women are going to be, in the electorate. It's still going to be more than men, right? So they're obviously really important for determining the election, but it's, but I think again this is. For people who are against Trump, like the tape, he said it's kind of consistent with what he's, I don't think it's necessarily a revelation in terms of, and if you're supporting him, you're not supporting because he holds views that are, PC, right? That's what we say. Yep, over there.
In the future, are you going to give us any insight as to the influence of Breitbart and its components like the Klan have on the Republican Party?
So what influence do particular groups like Breitbart and have on what goes on? I mean, I think that's hard. So the effect of, I think that, so what you see, I think, in terms of the media, right? I think it's undoubtedly that the case that now we're living in increasingly divergent worlds in terms of what's going on. So you think back to the 70s, right, when you had the evening news, everyone was watching CBS, ABC, NBC, everyone was getting the same information, right, from the same people, right? Whereas now I can select whatever I want to watch. I mean, so there's a fantastic set by the Wall Street Journal, for example. So a lot of people, especially younger people, are getting their news from Facebook and social media. And so they did this horrifying thing where they created like a staunch liberal and a staunch conservative persona, and they saw what types of news they got fed for different topics. And it's like different, not even different planets, it's like different universes in terms of how different they are. And I think there can't be any denying that that is important, right? Because if we're not getting the same, it's okay to get information from different places, but like the level of that disagreement then, if it manifests itself and so we can't agree on what's going on in the world, like what's true and what's fact, then that'd be really consequential. But again, this is not a new phenomenon. So one of my esteemed colleagues, Professor Bartels in the department, has this book where he shows, for example, in 1992, you ask someone how the economy's doing, right? This is during Bill Clinton's presidency. And if you're a Republican, you said the economy's horrible, right? Whereas if you're a Democrat, you think the economy's doing better than ever, right? And so this notion about partisanship affecting how we view the world is really, really critically important. I think it's being magnified now because now it's easier than ever to basically put my glasses on and then just only go to those sources where I'm talking to people who believe what I believe in and that kind of don't challenge what I think. And I think that's bad, right? Because I think we're better when we have disagreements and when we come together and figure out what's going on. And because things are, and also because there is this thing called truth, right? We're not in this kind of postmodern era where everyone can have your own facts. There are things about the world, and if you can't even understand what the world actually is, and there can be disagreements how we measure things and stuff like that, but how do we solve a problem we don't even agree that there is a problem to, right? And that's troubling.
Thank you so much.
Oh, sorry for going long, but.